What's up, guys, and welcome back to the Xennial Rewind. And I'm your host, Retro Gamer Gen X. Here's your other host, Moby. And in today's episode, we're going to go ahead and talk about generational battles, per se, I guess, if that's what you want to call it. But basically, it's going to be more about Generation X and the Millennials and how they think about each other. And then also, my man Moby here has his monologue today as well. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and check out Moby.
I'm Moby, and this is my monologue. And I wanted to monologue about special effects today because in the past week, I have seen two classic movies, Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park again. So Terminator 2, 1991, Jurassic Park, 1993. And as I was watching both films, I was shocked at how well the special effects hold up compared to films that I'm watching today. And when I was done the second film, which was Jurassic Park, I ended up just sitting on my couch, which is kind of sort of out of view, just about over there. I was thinking, why is this? Why do special effects 30 years later look a little bit worse? And I came to the conclusion that it's a problem with effort in compositing specifically, because those movies only use CGI when it was absolutely necessary. And then they use modeling and animatronics when those forms of special effects would perform better, would look better. And so you had CGI basically relegated to a creature or character running away in the distance where you needed that full body movement, that full body shot. And with that type of camera work, it actually looked really good. Like I said, even 30 plus years ago. But the problem is nowadays it gets overused. And it gets overused while the practical effects are not used where they need to be. Okay? And so I think one of the problems with that is that as well, like when you had Jurassic Park, you just had Industrial Light and Magic do all the CGI, okay? One simple studio. But nowadays, if you watch the credits, you get 10, 15, 20 different studios all working on these different effects, and no wonder it seems inconsistent. No wonder the quality is not as good. And I'm not meaning anything here to be controversial, but I do think it matters. A lot of these studios are overseas in places where English is not the primary language. And so you've got all these little studios, budget studios, let's be honest, a lot of them being paid not what you would be paid in North America to make special effects. And it's like too many cooks in the kitchen. They're all throwing in models here, doing a scene there. Reminds me actually of a video game I like. Not too many people like it outside of hardcore Resident Evil fans, but Resident Evil 0, that game used a couple different special effects studios for their videos, and you could totally tell it was clear as day which studio animated this scene and which studio animated this scene. And I think you're starting to see that a little bit more in movies. Inconsistency with the special effects, over-reliance on CGI, people not understanding enough the value of practical effects and properly compositing using a variety of techniques. So that's my rant. RGX, what do you think about that?
Man, I'll tell you what. I mean, the whole thing with CGI, I was kind of for it back in the day. When it first started, I remember the first thing I remember with like computer graphics was the Money Is for Nothing video by Dire Straits back in the 80s. That was the first thing I remember. And I remember as being like a kid, I think I was probably 9, 10 years old at the time. And I was like, man, this is the future. I'm like, look at how real everything looks. I'm like, wow, and back then everything was so blocky, but they started to get lighting and shading and all this other kind of stuff. And obviously technology got better and things just got way better as far as textures, lighting, shading, all that kind of stuff that they add into CGI now that makes everything just look real. I mean, it does. But at the same time, it's too damn real. You know what I mean? So as I watch these modern movies, and like I remember when the first Transformers, the Michael Bay Transformers came out, and this is a while back. When was it? Like 20 years ago or something like that? But
2007.
yeah, it's been quite a while. And I remember seeing that and going, wow, I mean, this is really cool. But at the same time, in my mind, I couldn't focus on them transforming and stuff. It was just kind of hard for me to get with it. And I don't know if that's a generational thing or not, if that's just because I'm getting old or whatnot. But I came from a generation, like you said, the stop motion animation. So a lot of that is what I grew up with, like Clash of the Titans from, I think that movie came out in 1980, 1981, something like that. I remember as a kid, that shit looks so real to me. I mean, it really looked real. I mean, and now I look at it and I'm like, damn, you can actually see like them. It's like the jerky movements and stuff, but back then, it was just so cool. And then you look at movies like E.T., for instance, with it's kind of just the animatronics and the puppeteering that they did with E.T. I mean, just how it looked back then so real, and now you watch E.T. and you're like, yeah, that does kind of look fake. But then you look at the movies nowadays with the new computer graphics, and it's like, it's too real. I mean, they try to add too much stuff in. So you'll see like explosions where shit will just be flying everywhere and this and that. And it's like, okay, come on. This is going to be Hollywood. That's not the way an explosion actually looks. Well, sometimes it does, depending on how big the explosion is. But for instance, how much does it take to produce a movie nowadays? How much money does it take? How much do you give these studios to have these big servers and these big computers and all this to go ahead and house all this? And you're actually paying all this money to these studios. When back in the day, you would pay these puppeteers not all that much to be able to do the same things. And people would sit there literally and do this frame by frame by frame by frame. And they still do it that way. But with computers and AI and the way everything is catching up now, it is so much faster. So instead of taking like, I don't know, 2-3 years to try to produce a movie, they can get an animated movie done in like 6 months to a year now. So, I mean, you're going to get more movies like that. And there's always going to be those positive negatives too. Like I said, you're going to get more movies, but are they going to be of greater quality or lower quality? It just kind of comes down to that. That's kind of how I see it, man. I mean, I like CGI, but they just do it to an extreme. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think you hit a good point there when you were talking, in my mind, when you're talking about how expensive these movies are becoming. Because, like you said, over-reliance on special effects, they're just cramming them full of, CGI and explosions you mentioned. And, like, look, there are a few areas where CGI actually has improved. I think they do vehicles and objects much better than 30 years ago. I think the more complicated shots involving, animal and human life, I won't get into that specifically, but I think they do a worse job with that. But you're right. Like, as far as stuff blowing up and shit flying everywhere, they're doing a better job. But then you've got every movie costing $200 million plus that uses those kind of effects. And a lot of people complain that we have too many sequels and that studios aren't taking risks. Well, when it's your butt on the line for signing off on a $200 million budget for a movie, you're much going to rather want to do a Star Wars sequel where you've got a certain built-in audience than, take some critically celebrated but fairly obscure new book on science fiction and make a new property on that, right? Because if you got to spend $200 million on that or Star Wars, one is a much safer bet to at least get something reasonable out of it from the ticket sales, whereas the risks could go, either direction. I mean, where I think this goes, or where I would hope this goes, is that people try to artists with new intellectual properties they're trying to make into movies, they instead try to focus on characters and dialogue, maybe use sets like the volume more, which Disney really pioneered for Star Wars, and now they use it in everything, their volume studio. That will help you keep costs down. But after all, RGX, people crave good drama, good writing, good acting performances. Those don't cost more money than the film stock and the actors and I guess the crew that you have on stage. But my point is, don't focus on the special effects. Don't make a 2-hour movie filled with 50 minutes of space battle. You don't always need that. So, that would be my response to what you said.
Yeah, man, and it kind of comes from a generational perspective as well, since that's what this is all about, this episode. So, I mean, really, the way I see movies and the way they were back in the day, like I said, to me, they seem so real. Even the horror movies back then, where you had all the fake blood and all this stuff. Nowadays, everything's done in CGI. So, does it look more real? Does it not? I mean, it kind of comes down to what you grew up with. And to me, it seems like the faker stuff, the stuff that was faked in the props and that kind of stuff looked more real to me than the CGI does. But to the younger generation, that's a little bit different. They look at it and they're like, oh man, that stuff looks so damn fake from the 1980s and 70s, So it's just kind of that kind of thing. But that brings me to a whole new point on this show. So let's talk about like generations and generational battles. So now, as everybody knows, this is the Xennial Rewind. So it's the cross between the Millennials and the Gen Xers and everybody in between. So there's always those little brothers and sisters that grew up with the Gen Xers that went through the same thing that we did, but not quite as much in like school and different things, and technology was a little bit different. So I kind of want to get everybody's perspective, or, Moby, your perspective on basically how you feel about Gen Xers and how I feel about millennials and that kind of thing. So, like, I'll go ahead and start off. So, for instance, like me, okay, a few years back, now, you think about a millennial as a Gen Xer, you think of them like somebody that goes to Starbucks every day and spends $5 on a coffee every day and gets avocado toast with their man purse and that kind of stuff. I mean, that's kind of what comes to mind. But honestly, generationally, things are different with the millennials than they were with Gen X, because you guys grew up when technology was already there. All the technology that we have nowadays and how it's involved, I mean, it might have been in its early forms when you guys were kids, but it was already there. There were already cell phones, there were already personal computers, there were already game systems, game consoles, cable TV, for God's sake. I didn't even have cable TV. We had a black and white TV with like 3 channels when we were growing up at first. And it's just crazy for people to think about that now. So that's kind of how I think of the millennials now, is that you guys have grown up. You guys are in your, late 30s, 40s now. You guys have learned a lot and seen a lot, kind of like us Gen Xers have. So I think we got a lot more in common with you guys, because, like, honestly, you guys were like our little brothers and sisters. So we have a lot more in common with you guys than, say, the boomers or Gen Z, which are now our kids. So it's kind of crazy. But what's your perspective of Gen X?
Yeah. So it's interesting because you actually keyed on one term that I was going to say was very important from my perspective. And this is something that I've actually discussed with my friends who are millennials before, not in preparation for the show, just because it was a fun conversation. But how do we compare to Gen X? You mentioned little brothers and sisters. And my first point was, we do truly see you as big brothers and sisters overall. And that's a good thing. Like, that's relatable. That's warm. That's friendly. I think one of the big things we saw, so my parents are both boomers. And I wonder if your parents are what they call like the missing generation, this gap between the greatest, war generation and
The silent generation. Yep.
the silent generation. That's it. Thanks, RGX. Silent generation. So my parents as boomers, I mean, it was weird growing up with them. They would talk about having this kind of cool childhood in the 70s, but they were what I would think of were mostly stereotypical parents. My parents were very much, you do this wrong, you get grounded, you need A plus grades through school, or, here's a reward if you get an A, but if you get a D, you're doing extra chores. Like, they seem like very traditional parents. Gen X was, you got to think of the marketing to Gen X in the 90s, right? Or late 80s even. Like neon pastel colors flashing on the screen, giving you epileptic seizures. It's like Gen X, big party generation, snowboarding. They didn't put this in TV, but we thought it. Marijuana use, pot. It was like you guys were party animals, and we kind of aspired to that because we didn't see that in our parents, and how our parents were living was kind of boring, to be honest, as boomers. And I hate to say it, but I think that boomer stereotype has been maintained 30 plus years of them kind of being very rules orientated. Let's do the right thing. Let's be calm and just be conservative. Not conservative in how they vote, though many of them do, but conservative just, let's live quiet, humble lives. And, there's Gen X holding an Orbitz. If you remember that stuff from the 90s, that gel-filled soda with beads as you snowboard, which was a new thing off a cliff, with a joint in your other finger. That's an exaggeration, but we saw you guys as that. Now, one change that started to happen in probably the last 10 to 15 years is coveting, is almost this contempt that you guys got to come to your young adult age and adults where you were getting into jobs during a time where the economy was very good. And millennials, and much more, I'll admit, Gen Z, is growing up in a really shitty economy where it's hard to buy, houses and stuff like that. I'm not going to say how much money I make, but I'm in the top 25% of, Canadian earners. And I have a nice little apartment here that I rent. But right now, there's no real hope for me to own a home where, my parents, if they made what I made, back 30 years ago, they would, be on a cruise ship most of the year. And I think there's part of millennials that say, hey, we were the last generation. This is something I'm going to get into with Gen Z. We were the last generation that was taught work hard, do these crappy jobs to pay for your college and schooling, because you get into the work world and you'll have all this money and financial freedom and retirement and to be able to buy a home. And between what happened after the Great Recession, there's so many different reasons I'm not going to get into, but why cost of living became a crisis. And we feel gypped, and we look back on Gen Z and be like, you guys had it easy. So I'm wondering what you think about that, Gen X. When us millennials think, oh, you had it easy becoming a young adult in the 90s and early 2000s, do you want to call me on that? Or do you think, yeah, we had it easier?
No, man, we definitely did not have it easy. So let's put it this way. When I first started, my first job, and my parents didn't buy me a car. So I was 16 years old, going to high school full time, basically having to work almost like a full-time job at a freaking fast food joint. But I was making $3.25 an hour is what I was making. $3.25 an hour. Okay. Now, granted, my car payment was only like $125. Insurance, although, was like $200 a month. Even back then, insurance was freaking expensive for, young males. And so really my whole paycheck went to my car. And then by the time I was, 18 or whatnot, my parents were like, well, either you go to college or you have to move. So it was like, well, I'm not going to college. So I had to move, get my own apartment, that kind of thing. And so we were just living, a normal life. But it was a struggle. I mean, we still did we had to eat ramen, that type of thing, because we didn't, I had like two roommates at one point in a 2-bedroom apartment just trying to make it. So honestly, my message to everybody is that as far as the younger generations is it's always going to be a struggle. Inflation happens. Okay. So like $3.25 back then would be, I don't know what it would be. I think it's like 4 times now. So it's like 12, maybe $13 an hour nowadays. I think that's what the minimum wage still is now, like in certain states and things. It's about 12, 13 bucks an hour. So really it hasn't changed all that much. Things have gotten more pricey, but the value of a dollar has changed as well. Now to be able to be successful, I think things have changed from when I was younger, because I grew up in a time where like my parents didn't go to college, but yet they had successful careers. My mom worked for the state, my dad worked for the federal government, and they did what they did and they retired with those jobs. They worked their 20, my dad worked 36 years at the same place, basically. My mom was 25 years. Hell, I haven't been able to keep a job for 6 years straight without getting laid off. I mean, so that dream for us was never there either. That whole American dream where you get out of high school, you get a job working as like, a stock boy at a grocery store. And by the time you're done, 30 years later, you're the district manager of the whole region or something, make on, 200 grand a year, that kind of thing. That's what it was supposed to be. White picket fences and barking dogs and kids, and that never really happened to Gen X. So, we feel your pain too. Trust me, we do. And everybody has gone through it. Now, the boomers, I know a lot of people want to talk shit about the boomers, but at the same time, you guys got to remember, these guys grew up in the 60s and we're like the hippie stoner generation that were making love and peace and all that. And they had to get their shit together to be able to do what they did. And I think that kind of comes to why they're so weird and greedy and get off my grass, and that type of shit. So, I mean, that's the way I feel about them. Which brings me to like another point in the conversation here. How do you feel about the boomer generation?
The boomer generation, I may be highly affected by my personal situation. So let me paint a picture very briefly here. Until I was 16 years old, I was raised on a hobby farm. We were the last property in my entire town eastwards, a very rural area. And I lived on a 10-acre plot that was essentially shared with another 10-acre plot. And my grandfather, with his bare hands, German grandfather, immigrated from Germany, built both homes with his bare hands himself. Plumbing, framing, everything. I don't know how he did it. But what that did create is an isolated environment where my parents had friends and they had kids that were cool, boys and girls that I would play with, have a play date maybe every 2 weeks. But I did not have a normal suburban or urban environment that I was developing growing up in until I was 16 years old. My parents divorced and I moved into a suburb closer to town. So it was a very insular view of boomers. I felt that they really struggled with the greatest generation, their parents, being able to express love to them. For example, my mom's mom didn't hug. If it was Christmas or your birthday, a hug was a handshake. I'm dead serious from her. And that was to the day that she died at the age of 100. And on my dad's side, it was Dutch. And if you don't know European backgrounds, Dutch and Germans are seen as somewhat cold and also very independent. And so from a very, very young age, I was raised to be independent. So were my brothers and sisters. Cook for yourself, clean for yourself, find your own things to do to play and keep yourself entertained, find your own ways to get the good grades in school. It's basically like figure it out or get punished somehow. I don't feel love was lacking in my family, but I felt like it severely affect my boomer parents. A few other things that are kind of more practical and interesting is, for example, my grandparents were like, oh, VCR and DVD players, we don't need those. What are those newfangled things? Well, my parents completely embraced DVDs and movies. Thank goodness. Movie nights were some of the best memories I ever have with my parents. We did them almost every single weekend. We got to do an episode on video stores and the experience of going to Blockbuster or Hollywood Video you guys had in the US, Rogers Videos up here. We'll get into that in a future episode. But my parents love that technology. But video games? Oh no. That's nerdy stuff for kids that don't want to be social. I remember my dad at one point, it only lasted about 6 months, but he would make us kids have to book an hour of outside exercise to play 1 hour of video games or computers. Now, I'm a big boy now, if you can't tell from these jowls, but I wanted to play video games and stuff like that and computer games when I was a kid. I exercised the hell out of myself because that was the only way I was going to get screen time. And you would not see that with millennial or Gen X parents. They wouldn't think that way. I think that boomers they'd been able to adjust to the digital revolution where, everything is Facebook and tablets and stuff like that and smartphones, but it took them a lot longer. Both my parents have adjusted. My stepdad, who's 10 years older than my mom, I think he's probably silent generation officially. He barely adapted. I think one of the differences is Gen X and millennials were able to quickly adapt because we just grew up with it. It's like, okay, I've now got this phone jack that goes into the wall and gives me the Phantom Menace movie trailer. As long as I download it for 18 hours, time it to go from a Sunday afternoon to Monday morning, I've got this great movie trailer. And we were just able to adapt. So I'll discuss Gen Z separately, but that's how I see boomers. What was your experience with boomers?
I have a whole different perspective of boomers because my parents are not from that generation. They're from the silent generation. So we'll kind of get into that too. But as far as them, the way my parents raised me and the way they see boomers, they see them as, like I said, the hippie, like stoner, Woodstock generation type people, and that's kind of my perception of them. And I see them as a generation that needed to learn themselves. There's a lot of things that went on during that time: the civil rights, women's rights, the Vietnam War. I mean, there was just so much shit going on, and it's like there was a little taste of that in the 2000s, like after 9/11 and that kind of stuff. There was kind of that same taste that was going on, the war going on, and it just kept dragging on, and so it seems like the millennials, you guys kind of got that taste of it too, but. Now, as far as the silent generation goes, I see them. My dad was really cool. My mom was really cool too, as far as letting us do things and experiencing things. So, for instance, I think the reason they did that is because they were that first generation too after World War II. They were born during World War II. So they were teenagers after the war while, everybody was going into the suburbs. They were that first generation that experienced that high school suburbia type of thing. Segregation in the schools. So it was no longer just white people. You had to go to school with other people as well, and, touchy subject, but they had to deal with that. And they're the first generation that had to do these kind of things. And along came with the segregation and mixing of cultures came rock and roll music. So that typical, black music ended up being heard by white people, and it evolved into rock and roll. So like the Chuck Berry and the Elvis Presley and all that kind of stuff. And just the things that those kids did, that no other generation before that kind of did. They were basically the forefathers of what everybody now is doing. So all these kids that, are doing their hair green and putting all these piercings in and getting tattoos and all that kind of stuff. All the rebellious shit that kids do nowadays. You can blame it on the silent generation. But yeah, that's kind of how I see my parents. I mean, they were really cool people. Now, they were very strict too. Very, very strict. So if we got in trouble, it wasn't just, oh, go take a timeout, Timmy. It was, you're going to get your fucking ass whooped. That's the way it was. And trust me, we got our asses whooped. But I think that's why we grew up to be good kids. I mean, I never really got into trouble or anything in my life, and because I learned right from wrong by getting my ass whooped all the time. But that's kind of how I see them, man. But let's go ahead and bounce it back to you. And what do you feel about Generation Z?
Gen Z is an enigma to me. And I do have a half-brother who's 17 years old. And so he's firmly part of Gen Z. I remember a conversation I had with him that probably sums it up, where I was like, his name is Zach. And I was like, hey, Zach, how was school? Because, you're in grade 11. Back then, I used to get thrown in lockers till about grade 8. Then I had a growth spurt. Then I started throwing the other kids in lockers, just for fun. How are you doing? And this kid, my half-brother's a good kid. He was horrified. He was like, what? Throw a kid in a locker? That's bullying. No one would ever do that. I'm like, whoa, okay. This was in movies. This is
obviously they weren't Gen X, man.
Thing. Yeah, it's weird that way. You know what? You're not so wrong, RGX. So, I mean, again, I'm a hefty boy, but I do jog to try to keep a mediocre of health. And one of my jogging routes takes me by our biggest high school in our small town, which is where my half-brother goes. And so I often go right after work where the Gen Zers are still hanging out there. And they're wearing the clothes in the 90s that you guys wore. And to a degree, we wore. Like the baggy jeans, the wallets with the chains, the Metallica t-shirts. I'm like, who are you kids? And this gets kind of metaphysical here, and I feel sad for Gen Z because I feel like they love the 1990s, which is why you're seeing this explosion of 1990s culture, but they love it because it was more real. You got to remember, they were the first generation where from their sentient, self-aware moments only know a digital world. Your money is on a card. You don't even really see it unless you really want to go to the bank and get cash. They saw physical movies and video games being phased out before their eyes. They saw physical, tactile stuff taken away from them as they were children. And I think to a degree, it's safe to say there's a minor amount of trauma to that. And also wistfulness that you and I, that our generations grew up in a time that was more real. I also think there's in group chats, me and my close buddies will joke in ways that are not socially acceptable nowadays. I'll just say that, humor, anything used to go. Gen Z, my half-brother and his friends and other Gen Zers I meet, family of friends that are mine, they're horrified by that kind of humor. It's like, no, this is terrible. You can never punch down on anyone. It almost seems like they've become this kind of goody two-shoes generation. I feel for them because, you and I, you've changed my mind, by the way, RGX. You have convinced me that I was wrong about the stereotype that Gen X grew up in an easy time to grow up. You painted a great picture of that. But as bad as you and I had it, Gen Z has it really bad. When those kids hit adulthood in this economy, this job market, with this cost of living crisis, no wonder so many of them are depressed. And the last point I'd make before I throw it back to you, because I'd be interested on your thoughts on Gen Z. Let's be honest with how we lived and talked in the films we saw, like American Pie. Those movies are stupid, but they are like an absolute touchstone of my generation. Everybody watched them. I mean, everybody. And I went to a private Christian high school, and everyone still watched that shit. But like, I find Gen Z's very sex averse. It's like, oh no, sex, not for me. Keep sex away. That's another difference that I see. So I'll throw this back at you. How do you, as a Gen Xer, see Gen Z?
Oh man, Gen Z. So my kid is a Gen Zer. So I see them as kids. I mean, really? Um, I don't know what to say about them. I really don't, because I know like my parents said the same shit about us, and I'm sure your parents said the same shit about you guys. But it's like they just don't take things for reality. I don't know how to explain it. It's like, okay, they want to cancel everything that they don't agree with, and just certain things like that just drive me nuts. It's like, okay, people have got to learn how to get along with each other. Just because you don't like what some person likes or is saying doesn't mean that, that's wrong, right, or whatever, but they have their opinion. Everybody has their rights to be able to say what the frick they want. You know what I'm saying? And so they've silenced a lot of people, even like social media people. It's kind of crazy what's happened with the power that this generation actually has, because they know how to control social media. And that's going to be a powerful thing one of these days, is not, being able to control that. So I think they, unlike me, where I grew up with game consoles and computers when they first started coming out, they're going to be the first generation to grow up with social media and AI. And they're going to be the generation working with this. So I think we're going to see their generation embracing this technology, where we're not going to, because the hell with that. I don't want some AI robot taking over what I do at work, that kind of thing. I don't want AI taking over doing my content. I want my content being real. That kind of stuff. But that's just kind of the way the world is going. And are you gonna, it's that thing. Are you with them or are you against them? So, and I see this generation, instead of being against it, they're gonna go with it, and it might help humanity out, might harm humanity. But you just don't know what's going to happen in these kind of situations. Now, as far as Gen Z and the way they feel about Gen Xers, and you guys are the millennials, and the boomers, obviously they really hate the boomers. Oh my God. All the stuff I see online about the boomers. And that's that whole thing, like you were talking about, how they're now starting to get into their 20s. They're starting to get those struggles trying to get a job straight out of college, but the jobs just aren't there. And the problem with this kind of is the whole thing with America and what's been going on and everything like that as well, because all the jobs we had in America, including mine when I worked at HP, shipped off seas to China and India and Taiwan and where at the hell else, overseas. And so all those good paying jobs, like I was getting good money working for HP. Now they're paying somebody over in wherever, India, I don't know, probably like maybe $10 an hour to do what I got a lot of money to do, And as a business standpoint, that's smart for the company because they're making a profit off of it. But it kills what's going on in our country. And I saw something really interesting today where they talk about becoming slaves to the products that you have. So it was like, I remember, it was some YouTube video I watched, and I'm sure it was like, I don't know what kind of show it was, but it was like a clip. It was a short. But they're like in a Western town, and this guy is showing them electric light bulbs and how it's going to change the world and all this. And these cowboys come up and they're like, so where do we get the electricity to get this? Oh, we'll supply the electricity for you. Okay, do I have to pay for the electricity? Yep, you got to pay for the electricity. So that means I got to take time out of what I'm doing for my family and everything to work, to make money, to be able to pay for this electricity. And it's that ongoing cycle. And that's what humans have done. We've become a slave to our own technology. And I'm just scared that Gen Z is going to do that to themselves. They are going to become slaves to their own technology. And I just don't want them to do that. So if any Gen Zers are out there, watching, don't become a slave to your technology. But yeah, that's kind of how I feel about them, man. I mean, they're a good generation of kids. They're not as stupid as us Gen Xers were. We did some stupid shit. Trust me. I think they've kind of learned because a lot of their parents are Gen Xers, and we're the find around and fuck around and find out generation, that type of thing. But they're not. They want to know what's going on, but they'll Google it and research it and watch YouTube videos before they'll do anything. So that's kind of how I see their generation, man. But they really need to start concentrating on focusing on what they're going to do for their future and stop blaming everything on everybody else. The only person in this world that's going to do anything for you is going to be you. And you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get going with life, or else you're going to be left behind, and you don't want that to happen. So that's kind of my message to them. So
as you've noticed, Leland Steele, our third co-host, is away. He's traveling, as he sometimes does. A very special trip. And Leland does our calls to action. I could never match up to him, but I do know that he points or pulls random percentages out of his butt that says 64.3% of you are watching without subscribing. So hit that subscribe button, hit the bell so that you make sure you're getting all the notifications of the show. We're trying to build something here, guys. I know it's not the flashiest show ever, but we hope the content and the passion behind it, the discussions are interesting. Like, subscribe. That's going to help us get more viewers. That's going to help us build a better community in the comments section, talking really cool shit, because at the end of the day, we want to interact with you. So in saying that, I thank you for spending your time with us on the show. And I've been Moby.
And I'm Retro Gamer Gen X, and you guys have a great night.